Are we on? Yeah. Thank you, BJ. It's a real pleasure to be here and to see the preceding presentation. I loved it. As many of you, I'm somewhat of a trained buff, so it was a great presentation. What I'm going to hopefully talk about is when our politicians didn't screw things up. And that's the creation of the Grand Canyon National Park. And apologies, I am going to actually read. So again, working in a university, they make us write these things down, and so let's see. And also, I did my PowerPoint presentation before I finished the paper, so it's a little bit out of order, so there'll be a little back and forthing, and hopefully you won't get any vertigo or anything from what we're doing here. There we go. As I mentioned yesterday, I'm a real fan of Representative then Senator Carl Hayden. This is him in his prime. Those of you, there may be a few of you that were able to vote for him in his last election in 1962. But he was a sheriff of Maricopa County, and before he became representative, and until Robert Byrd was the longest serving senator in the history of the country. So I'm going to get started, and again, apologies, I am reading, but the ongoing and persistent irony of the American West is that for all its independence and frontier resilience and perseverance, it is the region of the country most dependent on the federal government and its representatives in the U.S. Congress. This was particularly true for the newly minted state of Arizona in the first quarter of the 20th century. And inarguably, no Arizona representative had more of an impact on the state throughout the 20th century than Carl T. Hayden. This is, I stole his biography from Britannica, so I did not write that, but hopefully you can read that. Carl Hayden was elected as Arizona's first member of the House of Representatives in 1912 on statehood. As a native Arizonan, he had a long and abiding love affair with the state and its wild areas. Before the turn of the century, as a young man, he made the first of many visits to northern Arizona and the Grand Canyon. It is no surprise then that as floor manager in the House, Hayden was instrumental in the eventual passage of the 1919 legislation establishing Grand Canyon National Park. This legislative quest began in earnest in 1917, although there were antecedent attempts prior to 1917. With the creation of the National Park Service in 1916, additional incentive existed to change the status of the Grand Canyon. In addition to Representative Hayden, the players involved in this legislative quest included iconic Arizona politicians and larger-than-life characters such as Henry Fountain Ashurst, George W.P. Hunt, Ralph and Niles Cameron, and William W. Bass. Let me see who we got here. That's Henry Fountain Ashurst. Now, probably many of you know this, but I didn't know that his father actually died in the Grand Canyon, and I believe is buried in a Grand Canyon cemetery. Good, I was right. Thank you. This is, and I'll talk more about W.W. Bass, this is one of the pictures from our repository. Just about everything I'm going to be talking about and showing is from the 100 Years of Grand Digital Repository. Okay. In February 1919, legislation sponsored by Representative Carl Hayden of Arizona passed the House of Representatives establishing Grand Canyon National Park. In addition to Representative Hayden's sponsorship, many of you may not have known this, of women's suffrage in the House, he was the House sponsor for women's suffrage in 1919. The establishment of Grand Canyon National Park stands as a signal legislative achievement. The move from national monument status to status as one of America's premier national parks reflected a complex political ballet involving the federal government, the nascent state of Arizona, its legislative delegation, and numerous localities and business interests. This presentation primarily will follow the legislative battle from 1917 to 1919 and will rely heavily on the extensive correspondence during the time period found primarily in the papers of Carl T. Hayden. I was told by Roy Elson, his last administrative assistant, that Senator Hayden actually rarely used the T, which stands for Trumbull. His father was Charles Trumbull Hayden, and almost always used Carl Hayden, so FYI. It is particularly relevant that during the centennial of the creation of Grand Canyon National Park, the issues and political struggles preceding the final legislative victory are examined. While it would seem that in current parlance, a national park at the Grand Canyon would be a no-brainer, the political, bureaucratic, and personal battles that went into the move from national monument to national park status would take several years and would involve the twists and turns of any good piece of fiction. From the National Archives, I've included here the legislative history of the Grand Canyon. Let's see. There we go. Oh, and I'm going to go back. I mentioned this is actually Governor Hunt at the canyon in '33, which is past this time, but it is an iconic photograph of him in his white linen suit. ASU Library probably has, I don't know, 500 photographs of him, which would appear to be every resident of Arizona at the time he ran for governor. And this is one he took at the park. Okay. While the movement to transfer the Grand Canyon National Monument, let me go back to there we go, into a national park had many supporters up to the bill's passage in 1919, one of the earlier and more interesting of those writing to newly minted Representative Hayden occurred toward the end of his first term. In December 1914, John M. Gaines, writing for the Campfire Club's Committee on Conservation of Forests and Wildlife, sparked the initial impetus that lit a fire under the movement to establish a national park at the Grand Canyon. The opening sentences of the letter encapsulates the sentiment that would eventually push toward the successful legislation. Now let me see where we are here. Oh, there. No, that's okay. He stated that the Campfire Club of America is greatly interested in the proper preservation of the Grand Canyon of the Colorado. We feel that the present status of the canyon as a national monument is not commensurate with its importance as a national asset and does not adequately provide for its preservation for all time, nor for proper administration, nor for its greatest usefulness to the people as a whole. One of the reasons I put this in, I love the old letterheads. I think it's too bad not only do we not write letters anymore, we don't have wonderful letterheads like that. This letter received enough circulation that several early supporters of the effort to make the Grand Canyon a national park referenced it. Within a month of the Campfire letters, Representative Hayden wrote to Willis Borg, the Secretary of the Flagstaff Board of Trade, responding to the resolution on the establishment of a national park at the Grand Canyon. Hayden wrote, "I am just in receipt of your letter transmitting a resolution regarding the establishment of the Grand Canyon National Park, and I am greatly interested in this matter. In changing the present national monument to a national park, care must be exercised, however, that the water power and mineral resources of the canyon are made available for use." Hayden's response encapsulates much of the Sturm und Drang that went into hammering out the literal, entrepreneurial, and environmental parameters of the park. In 1916, much of the activity revolved around continuing to explore and garner support for the transformation into Grand Canyon National Park. In May of 1916, Hayden received a letter from Governor George W.P. Hunt supporting the establishment of Grand Canyon National Park and echoing the sentiments expressed by Hayden in his letter to Borg. However, in January 1916, the president of Flagstaff's Arizona Central Bank expressed a less optimistic view stemming from concerns over grazing rights. He wrote, "The Grand Canyon National Park may be all right, and if it must be made, don't let them take away all of the grazing lands of northern Arizona in doing so." Over the next 3 years, the concerns and interests expressed dealt more with developing and maintaining commercial, mineral, water, and grazing activities than with the establishment, administration, and preservation of one of the country's scenic and recreational wonders. Later in 1917, Secretary of Agriculture Houston underscored this when he testified that the bill contains several features which are not usually written into national park laws, such as authorizing development of water power and permitting mining. But back in 1916, the seminal event of that year was the creation of the National Park Service by the Organic Act of 1916 in August of that year. As a part of the Department of Interior, the National Park Service, under the initial leadership of Stephen Mather, provided the bureaucratic and programmatic home for the new national park system, which by 1919 would include Grand Canyon National Park. While the Forest Service wasn't initially or totally on board with losing administrative control, it had an air of inevitability. As Secretary of the Interior, Franklin Lane stated in his testimony to the Committee on Public Lands in early February 1917, in the very nature of things, however, the Grand Canyon cannot, as a section of two national forests or a national monument, be properly developed for the public benefit, and it cannot be effectively administered or adequately protected. At the same hearing, Secretary of Agriculture Houston opined that the proposed boundary lines of the park was considered by representatives of this department, the National Park Service, and the congressman from Arizona, Hayden. And it is believed it is the proper one to secure a practical administration of both the national park and national forest lands. The seminal year for the beginning of actual legislative action on the creation of the park occurred in 1917. In February of that year, the aforementioned Senate Bill 8250 was introduced as the first bill to establish the national park. To clear up the confusion, which to me, that I at least had, as to why this bill was not the final legislation acted, which was 65 Senate 390, in 1917, the new sessions of Congress started in March of that year, so the original bill had to be reintroduced and renumbered for the new Congress. The other difference was that Senator Henry Fountain Ashurst introduced 64 Senate 8250, whereas Senator Marcus Aurelius Smith introduced 65 Senate 390. Both bills started in the same classic language, establishing their clear intent. Be it enacted that by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that there is hereby reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or disposal under the laws of the United States and dedicated and set apart as a public park for the enjoyment of the people under the name of the Grand Canyon National Park, their tract of land in the state of Arizona, particularly described by and indicated within metes and bounds as follows, to wit. And what follows to wit is 131 lines of text delineating the boundaries of the park as established by legislation. It is an enduring feature of national park legislation that the bulk of the legislative bill itself will deal with setting the boundaries of the park. And it is the delineation and description of these actual boundary statements that incur much of the discussion and controversy prior to the passage of the enabling legislation. In early 1917, Representative Hayden issued a statement, which today would most likely be called a press release, on the creation of Grand Canyon National Park. And this was for Arizona. This was a press release as a representative that was addressed mostly to the people of Arizona. In response to a general demand that a national park be created at the Grand Canyon in Arizona, Honorable Carl Hayden has introduced in the House a carefully prepared bill, the enactment of which will accomplish this purpose. The area of the present monument is 1,260 square miles, but the proposed park will contain only 996 square miles, so that 264 sections of land that are now withdrawn from all forms of entry will be made available for grazing and other uses. It is the intention of the bill that nothing but the scenic portions of the canyon with sufficient areas back from the rim to permit the construction of roads shall be included within the national park. Section 2 of the bill provides that the Grand Canyon National Park shall be administered by the Secretary of the Interior in accordance with the National Park Services Act, which became law last year. The Hayden bill fully protects the interests of those who have heretofore acquired property rights within the proposed park. Provision is made for the development of water power under existing laws, and the Secretary of Interior is authorized to permit mining whenever consistent with the primary purposes of the park. It is believed that by the establishment of a national park at the Grand Canyon, the way will be provided for securing appropriations from Congress for the construction of roads and trails, which will make the canyon more accessible to visitors. Over 100,000 tourists visit the Grand Canyon in 1915, but an even larger number are certain to come each year, particularly if good roads are constructed so that automobiles can drive along the rim and view the greatest natural wonder of the world. In this statement, Hayden hits all the areas and issues that particularly for the appeal to Arizonans and presages themes and issues that continue to this day. Water power, road building, and tourism to Arizona were hallmarks of Hayden's 50-plus years in Congress. However, the Grand Canyon legislation hit a roadblock that effectively tabled consideration of the initial bill into 1918. By March, it was very clear that the storm clouds of war were threatening their downpour on the United States. Hayden clearly saw war approaching and was willing to delay the legislation until 1918. He wrote, "I presume that by this time the Honorable Curator, T.H. Curator, has shown you my letter advising him that no action was taken on the bill to establish the Grand Canyon National Park, so that it will be necessary to reintroduce this measure in the next session of Congress." However, let's see if I'm not sure what I have here. Here we go. However, although the bill itself was tabled, 1917 saw the emergence of W.W. Bass, the longtime Grand Canyon entrepreneur, as the main protagonist of the Grand Canyon bill as written. From 1917 to 1919, the ASU Digital Repository alone has over 20 letters to or from from Hayden Bass. For decades, both before and after 1917, Bass was a significant predominant figure in tourism and commercialism at the Grand Canyon. He almost single-handedly led the somewhat tenuous campaign to have at least part of the Grand Canyon declared an Arizona state park. In July 1917, Bass wrote to Hayden from Los Angeles, as you can see, outlining his thoughts on a state park at the canyon. Regarding your letter in relation to the National Park at Grand Canyon, I find that there is considerable objection as to the tying up of the entire region so that there will be no chance in the future of segregating any portion of it for the people of Arizona. There's strong feeling that a certain portion not now occupied or utilized in any manner should be set apart for this class of visitors as a state park where provisions could be made for all their wants. It would seem as though our citizens should have some consideration before this matchless wonder is entirely placed under federal control. There's a movement on foot at the present time to give us this consideration. The enclosed clipping will suggest to your mind some of the nature of this petition. There we go. From the Wickenburg Sun. Okay, I will wrap up. Bass was fighting a losing battle, however. On February 15th, the day after Arizona statehood, Senate 390 was referred in the Senate with its hearing occurring on March 21st in the Senate Committee on Public Lands. Within days of the committee report, Hayden replied to several letters from W.W. Bass. I have your letters of March 4th and 8th in regard to the proposed Park. The Senate Committee on Lands has favorably reported Senator Asher's bill with certain amendments. Provision is also made for letting of concessions to the best and most responsible bidder. I understand the section was inserted at the request of Mr. Hurst, who owns the Grandview property. This letter admirably illustrates some of the concessions and sausage making necessary to please and appease many, but certainly not all of the extant interested parties involved in the soon-to-be-born Grand Canyon National Park. All right, I'm going to jump at this point. At this point, can I just finish up? One more minute. Okay, I'll go to my conclusion here. What happened, actually, I'll just finish up, is that there was the reason it did not happen until February is that the House actually, the Senate reported the bill out, approved the bill in May of 18. The House did not act upon it until October after the committee report, so that was why there was a delay in the approval of the bill itself. Okay, as I said, now there were 2 letters from Bass actually asking for it not to pass. Senate 65-270 became Public Law 65-277 on February 26, 1919, officially ending the legislative struggle to establish the park in Arizona. On the same day, President Wilson signed Senate 390, Secretary of the Interior Lane wrote to the Secretary of the Treasury, in view of the fact by the President's signature today has become law, I enclose an estimate in the sum of $7,500 to meet the expense of administration and protection of the park covering the final quarters of the present fiscal year. The estimate has my full approval. Thus, with the outstretched hand of the federal bureaucracy, the legislative quest to establish Grand Canyon National Park is both confirmed and initially funded. Carl Hayden, along with his colleagues in the Senate, inhabitants and entrepreneurs at the Grand Canyon, and Arizona politicians and citizens of all stripes, struggled and succeeded in the quest to create a national park at one of the truly national wonders of the entire world.